What would you have done if you watched a man get thrown out of his own son's engagement party in front of 200 guests because he showed up in work boots and a flannel shirt? I'll tell you what happened when nobody stepped in. And I'll tell you exactly what that billionaire's face looked like when he realized what he'd just done. Stay with me. The moment Clifton Mace walked into the Hargrove Grand Ballroom, the room changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was subtle, the way a cold front moves in before the rain actually falls. A few heads turned. A few conversations dropped half a syllable short. A woman near the champagne tower touched her pearl necklace without knowing why. Clifton Mace, 53 years old, black, with the weathered hands of a man who'd spent 30 years working before he ever sat behind a desk, didn't notice any of it. Or if he did, he didn't show it. He had that kind of stillness about him. The kind that made uncomfortable people even more uncomfortable, because they couldn't figure out what to do with a man who didn't react. He was wearing what he always wore when he traveled straight from a work site. Dark canvas pants, a clean but clearly inexpensive flannel button-down, and steel-toed work boots that tells had a faint streak of red Georgia clay along the heel. He'd driven 4 hours from Macon without stopping to change, because his daughter had called him that afternoon and said, "Daddy, I think tonight's going to be a lot. I just need to know you're going to be there." So, he was there. He didn't know yet what kind of room he was walking into. He didn't know that the Hargrove family had spent $11,000 on the floral arrangements alone. He didn't know that the engagement party for his daughter, Zoe, and her fiancé, Elliot Hargrove, had been, from the start, less of a celebration and more of a performance, staged entirely for one audience member, Wallace Hargrove. Wallace Hargrove, 61, white, founder and majority owner of Hargrove Capital Group, a private equity firm with holdings across 12 states, was the kind of man who entered rooms the way weather systems do, with advance warning and unavoidable effect. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, perpetually tan from a standing weekly golf game, and possessed of a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd been on the cover of Forbes twice. He donated to 3 university endowments. He gave to exactly the charities that made other wealthy men take him seriously, and none of the ones that might actually require him to change his worldview. His wife, Constance Hargrove, 58, stood 3 steps to his left, as she always did, close enough to appear united, far enough to have plausible deniability. She wore a gown the color of aged champagne and spoke to everyone in a warm, floating tone that said nothing and committed to nothing. She was good at that. Their son, Elliot Hargrove, 29, stood across the room near the entrance, watching the door. Elliot was, and this is the word every person who met him eventually landed on, decent. Genuinely, stubbornly, sometimes inconveniently decent. He'd grown up watching his father reduce people to their net worth. And somewhere around age 14, he'd decided, quietly and permanently, that he wanted to be nothing like that. He'd gone into landscape architecture instead of finance. He drove a used pickup truck. He coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings. And 2 years ago, at a community garden fundraiser in Atlanta, he'd met Zoe Mace. Zoe Mace, 26, was a pediatric occupational therapist. She was the kind of person who remembered every child's name, every parent's worry, every small victory. She was funny and direct and had a laugh that made strangers turn around. She was also a single mother to a 4-year-old named Beau, from a relationship that had ended before Beau was born. A fact she'd told Elliot on their second date, clearly and without apology, and which Elliot had received with the same ease he received everything about her. Wallace Hargrove had received it differently. From the moment Elliot had brought Zoe home, Wallace had been, in the language of people who pride themselves on never saying the quiet part loud, concerned. He was concerned about the age gap, negligible. Concerned about her situation, Beau. Concerned about whether she and Elliot were really compatible. They were. Concerned, in ways he never articulated directly, but managed to communicate with surgical precision about everything Zoe was and everything she came from. He'd never once asked about her work. Never asked about Beau. never asked about her family. Tonight, Elliot had told Zoe was supposed to be a fresh start. Wallace had agreed to host the engagement party. Surely that meant something. Zoe had told Elliot she hoped so. Then she'd called her father. Clifton Mace found his daughter near the side hall, away from the main floor, standing with a flute of sparkling water she hadn't touched. She was wearing a burgundy dress that Elliot had helped her pick out, her natural hair pinned up with a few curls loose at her temples. She looked beautiful. She also looked like she'd been holding her breath for 45 minutes. She saw her father and exhaled. "You made it," Zoe said. "Said I would." Clifton hugged her, and the hug lasted a few seconds longer than usual. "Where's Elliot?" He's making rounds with his father." She glanced toward the main floor. It's been fine. It's been fine so far." Clifton didn't say anything. He looked at his daughter's face and read everything she wasn't saying, the way he'd been reading her since she was 3 years old. "Where's Beau?" he asked. "With Aunt Lorraine." "I didn't." She paused. "I thought it might be better if he wasn't here tonight." Clifton nodded slowly. He understood what that meant. She'd chosen not to bring her 4-year-old son to meet his future grandfather because she wasn't sure how that grandfather would treat him. He didn't say anything about that either. He just put his hand briefly on her shoulder and said, "Show me where the food is." It was Wallace Hargrove who noticed Clifton Mace first. He saw him from across the room, this large, dark-skinned man in work clothes, moving through a ballroom full of people in evening wear, and for a moment his expression did something complicated. Then it settled into the particular kind of rigid courtesy that wealthy men use when they are already deciding what to think about someone. He crossed the room. "Excuse me," Wallace said. His voice had the practiced authority of a man who'd never had to raise it to be heard. He planted himself 2 feet in front of Clifton, which was close enough to be an assertion. "Are you with the catering staff? Because the service entrance is." Clifton Mace looked at him. He didn't react. He didn't tense or flush or fumble. He just looked at Wallace Hargrove with a steady, unhurried gaze and said, "No." Wallace blinked. That was not the response pattern he was used to. "Then I'm going to need you to tell me who you are and why you're here. I'm Zoe's father." A beat of silence. Wallace's jaw moved slightly. He recalibrated. "I see." He looked Clifton up and down, the work boots, the flannel, the clay-streaked heel, and the recalibration landed somewhere that wasn't much better than where he'd started. "You came like that?" "I came from a job site," Clifton said. "She asked me to be here, so I'm here." "Right," Wallace's voice took on a texture. Polished dismissal. The kind you have to practice. "Well, this is a formal event. My family put considerable effort into this evening." He gestured broadly at the room. "I'd appreciate it if guests were dressed appropriately. For Elliot's sake, if nothing else." Clifton said nothing. "I'm not trying to be unkind," Wallace continued. "I just think Wallace." Elliot's voice came from behind his father. He'd seen it from 30 feet away. He'd started moving the moment he saw his father approach Clifton, and now he was standing between them, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has long rehearsed for a moment he hoped would never come. "This is Zoe's father," Elliot said. "His name is Clifton Mace. He's a guest." "I know who he is," Wallace said. "Then treat him like a guest." A stillness fell between father and son. Around them, the nearest cluster of guests had gone quiet. Someone near the ice sculpture had stopped mid-sentence. Wallace lowered his voice, but not by much. "Elliot, I have 200 people in this room, and I have a standard. I don't care about the standard tonight." Elliot's voice didn't shake. "Not this one." Zoe had appeared at Clifton's side. Her hand found his arm. Wallace looked at his son, then at Zoe, then at Clifton Mace, standing there in his flannel shirt and work boots with the same unreadable stillness, and Wallace made a calculation. "Wrong one." "I think," Wallace said, loud enough now that the people trying not to listen no longer had a choice, "that this evening would go more smoothly if certain guests understood what kind of event this is." He paused, just long enough. "This isn't a cookout." The room went cold. 200 people heard it. Some of them looked away. Some looked at the floor. A few looked at Wallace with something unreadable, and one woman near the back, a college friend of Elliot's named Bethany, who'd driven from Charlotte, pressed her lips together and shook her head, very slightly, at nobody in particular. Elliot went very still. Zoe's grip on her father's arm tightened. Clifton Mace, for his part, did the thing that might have been the most devastating thing he could have done in that moment. Nothing. He didn't look away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get emotional. He stood exactly as he had been standing, and he looked at Wallace Hargrove with an expression that said, very quietly, "I've met men like you before. You're not new." It was Elliot who spoke. "We're done here." He said it to his father without raising his voice. Then he turned to Zoe and Clifton. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Elliot." Constance Hargrove had materialized at her husband's elbow, her voice a soft, urgent murmur. "Don't make a scene, Mom." Elliot turned to her, and something in his expression made her stop. When he was saying that, that was the scene. He took Zoe's hand. He looked at his father one more time. "Zoe is my fiancée," he said. "Beau is going to be my stepson, and Clifton Mace is going to be my family. If you can't live with that," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He just said, "Excuse us," and walked Zoe and her father toward the side of the room. The silence that followed Wallace Hargrove was the loudest thing in the ballroom. They stood in a side corridor near the coat room, Elliot, Zoe, and Clifton, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Then Zoe said, "I'm sorry, Daddy, I didn't know he was going to." "Don't apologize," Clifton said. "You've got nothing to apologize for. He embarrassed you in front of Zoe." His voice was the same even, unhurried voice it always was. "I've been embarrassed by better men than Wallace Hargrove. I'll survive it." He looked at Elliot. "You all right, son?" Elliot, who was 29 and had just publicly confronted his father for the first time in his life, took a breath and said, Yeah, I think I am." Clifton studied him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the particular kind of approval that doesn't need words. "I want to go get Beau," Zoe said quietly. "I want him here. I don't want to hide him anymore." "Then we'll go get Beau," Elliot said. Clifton said, "I'll stay." Both of them looked at him. "Go get the boy," Clifton said. "I'll be here when you get back." What happened in the next 40 minutes in the Hargrove ballroom was the kind of social experience that people describe for years at dinner tables. Not loudly, quietly, with a particular kind of satisfaction. Wallace Hargrove moved through the room, and the room moved around him differently than it usually did. The architecture of social warmth, the turned bodies, the extended hands, the leaning in, was missing. People were polite. They were not warm. His longtime attorney, a man named Douglas, had a conversation with him about the weather that lasted 45 seconds. His daughter-in-law's cousin, someone he'd never bothered to learn the name of, walked past him without looking up. At the bar, two of Elliot's college friends talked around him in a conversation they didn't quite include him in. He was not being shunned, nothing so dramatic. He was simply being given, very precisely, the same amount of warmth he had offered. Constance moved to his side and said, very quietly, "You went too far. I said what needed to be said, Wallace." She paused. For once the floating tone wasn't there. "You don't know anything about that man. I know what I saw." Constance looked at him for a moment with something in her eyes that had been building for a long time. Then she walked away without finishing the thought. Clifton Mace, alone in the ballroom, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, thanked her by name after reading her name tag, and found a seat near a window. He was not uncomfortable. He was a man who had learned a long time ago that other people's discomfort with him said very little about him. He sat. He watched the room. He waited for his daughter to come back with his grandson. He didn't know that across the ballroom, 3 people were having a conversation about him. One was Bethany, Elliot's friend from Charlotte, who had been quietly doing something on her phone for the last 20 minutes. One was a man named Stewart, a venture partner at a firm done business with Hargrove Capital. And the third was a woman named Reese, who handled development for a hospital network in Atlanta. "You know who he is?" Bethany was saying, showing them her phone screen. Stewart leaned in, then leaned back. Huh. Reese looked for a long moment. That's Clifton Mace, that's Clifton Mace. Stewart took a slow sip of his drink. Wallace just called that man's party a cookout. Nobody said anything for a moment. Somebody should tell him, Reese said. Let him find out, Bethany said. Wallace Hargrove found out 12 minutes later. It came from Stewart, who was not a man given to cruelty, but was also not a man given to protecting people from consequences they'd earned. He came to Wallace with his tablet and said, simply, "You know who Zoe's father is?" Wallace looked at the screen. The first thing he saw was the headline from a 2019 Atlanta Business Chronicle feature, Clifton Mace, the quiet architect of Georgia's largest minority-owned construction group, then the 2022 profile from a trade journal, then the grant announcements, then the Workforce Development Initiative, then the photograph of Clifton Mace shaking hands with the governor, then the number. The current estimated value of Mace Construction and Development Group, $480 million. Wallace's face did something that faces don't usually do in public. The color changed. The muscles went slack for just a moment before reassembling into control. Wallace started. He came from a job site, Stewart said evenly. He still goes to job sites. Wallace looked up from the tablet. Across the room, through 200 guests in evening wear, he could see Clifton Mace sitting calmly by the window with a glass of water. A man who was worth nearly $500 million, sitting in Wallace's ballroom in work boots and a flannel shirt, because his daughter had needed him and he'd come straight. The weight of what he'd said, "This isn't a cookout," landed differently now, heavier, and not for the reason Wallace was currently feeling it land. The doors opened at the far end of the room, and Elliot walked back in with Zoe beside him. Zoe was holding the hand of a 4-year-old boy in a little navy sweater. Beau, wide-eyed and curious, turning his head to take in the chandeliers and the flowers and the crowd of dressed-up strangers. The room responded to the child the way rooms always respond to small children who are not yet self-conscious. It softened. A woman near the entrance smiled automatically. A man at the bar crouched down to his level for a moment and made a face that made Beau cover his mouth and laugh. Zoe guided Beau through the room toward the window where her father was sitting. Clifton saw them coming and stood up. Beau saw his grandfather and let go of his mother's hand. He crossed the ballroom at full 4-year-old speed, arms pumping, navy sweater slightly askew, and Clifton caught him and lifted him in one easy motion, and the boy's laugh rang out across the whole room, bright and uncontained, and for a moment it was the only sound in the Hargrove Grand Ballroom. Wallace Hargrove, standing 30 feet away, watched it. He stood there for a long time. The room had moved on. People were talking again, the music had resumed, someone was telling a story near the bar, and a group was laughing at the punchline. The party was still a party. But Wallace was standing very still in the middle of it, watching his son put his hand on the shoulder of Clifton Mace, watching Zoe settle her little boy on her father's lap, watching the three of them talk in the easy, unhurried way of people who trust each other completely. And Wallace understood something. He hadn't just insulted a guest. He hadn't just embarrassed a man in front of 200 people. He had looked at Clifton Mace, a man who had built something real from nothing, a man who drove to job sites at 53 because the work still mattered to him, a man who dropped everything and drove 4 hours without stopping to change because his daughter needed him. And he had seen only what Clifton was wearing. He had not seen the man at all. Constance appeared beside him. This time she didn't say anything. She just stood there, which was worse. "I should," Wallace started. "Yes," Constance said. "You should." It took him another 4 minutes to actually move. That was honest, and it matters, because men like Wallace Hargrove don't cross rooms like this in a hurry. There's too much to reckon with on the way. But he crossed it. He stopped in front of Clifton Mace, who had Beau on his lap and was letting the boy examine his watch with the focused intensity only 4-year-olds can bring to a wristwatch. Elliot and Zoe both went quiet. Clifton looked up. "I owe you an apology," Wallace said. His voice was controlled, but the control was work. What I said, the way I spoke to you, that was wrong. It was disrespectful, and it was. He stopped, made himself say the harder word. It was prejudiced. I looked at you and I made assumptions I had no right to make. He paused. I'm sorry. Clifton looked at him for a long moment. Bo had stopped examining the watch and was now examining Wallace with the same focused intensity, the way children examine things they haven't yet been taught to pretend not to notice. Mr. Hargrove, Clifton said, I appreciate you saying that. Wallace waited. But I need you to understand something. Clifton's voice was the same steady, unhurried voice it had been all night. The apology, I'd want it even if I wasn't who I am. Even if I worked for your catering company. Even if I'd never built anything in my life. He looked at Wallace directly. The way you treated me tonight wasn't wrong because of who I turned out to be. It was wrong because of who I was when I walked in. Wallace said nothing. Bo reached up and patted his grandfather's arm, apparently satisfied that the grown-up conversation had gone on long enough, and it was time to redirect everyone's attention to more interesting topics, like whether there was cake. There was cake. There was a great deal of cake, and Bo approached it with the seriousness it deserved. The rest of the evening moved differently, not perfectly. Wallace was not a man who transformed in a night, and no one pretended otherwise. But something had shifted in the room, something that would take time to name and longer to build on. Constance sat with Zoe for 30 minutes near the window and listened, actually listened, for the first time. Elliot and Clifton talked for a long while near the bar, and Clifton told him a story about building his first house in Macon at 24, with a borrowed circular saw and a borrowed truck, and Elliot laughed at the right moments and asked real questions. At the end of the night, when the guests were filing out and the servers were folding tablecloths and the chandelier had been dimmed, Clifton found Zoe by the coat room. You doing okay? He asked. Zoe thought about it. Yeah, she said. I think I actually am. Good. He hugged her. He loves you. That boy loves you right. He does. She pulled back and looked at her father. I'm sorry you had to, Zoe. He said it the same way he'd said it all night. I'd do it again tomorrow. You know that. She did know that. She'd always known that. That was exactly why she'd called him. I want to ask you something before I let you go. How many times in your life have you walked into a room and been sized up before you opened your mouth? Assessed by what you were wearing, where you came from, what you drove, what you looked like, before anyone bothered to find out who you actually were. If you've never experienced that, you are fortunate, and I hope you remember this story the next time you catch yourself making that same judgment about someone else. And if you have experienced it, if you've ever been the person in the work boots in the ballroom, I hope you carry some of Clifton Mace's stillness with you, the kind that doesn't need to explain itself, the kind that knows the room's reaction says more about the room than it says about you. The lesson tonight isn't really about the $480 million. That's not the point. The point is what Clifton said to Wallace at the end. The apology would mean the same thing if I'd never built anything. That's the whole story, right there. Worth isn't earned, respect isn't conditional. And the people who need to learn that lesson the hardest are usually the ones most convinced they already know it. If this story hit you somewhere real, leave a comment below and tell me. Tell me what you would have done when Wallace said what he said. Would you have spoken up? Would you have looked away? There's no wrong answer. I just want to know. If you're new to Glen Stories, subscribe. We're here every week with exactly this. Stories about the moments that test who we really are and the people who show us what it looks like to pass that test. And share this one. Someone in your life needs to hear Clifton Mace's answer.